Ethan grabbed Charlotte's arm and pulled her back from the mirror. "You are not walking into that gala," he said. "Not tonight. Not beside me." She turned to face him. "Ethan, I mean it." His voice dropped to something colder than anger. "You don't fit the image I need people to see tonight." Then he straightened his tie, picked up his phone, and walked out the door to the woman already waiting downstairs. His assistant, 28 years old, everything he wanted his life to look like now. Charlotte stood alone in the penthouse he never could have built without her, and something inside her finally broke open. If someone has ever made you feel invisible, stay until the very end of this story. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far Charlotte's story has traveled. And if you're new here, please subscribe, because what happens next will change everything. The morning of the Hawthorne Foundation Gala began. Like most mornings in the Caldwell penthouse, with Charlotte already awake, already working, already making herself invisible, so that Ethan's day could unfold without friction. She had been up since 5:30, not because she couldn't sleep, though sleep had become something of a stranger to her lately. She was up because there were things to do, and in the Caldwell household, things getting done meant Charlotte was already doing them. She had reviewed the notes Ethan had asked her to compile about the foundation's board members. She had cross-referenced the names of the donors who would be attending with the speeches Ethan had given over the past 2 years, flagging the moments when he had praised their contributions so he wouldn't accidentally thank the wrong man or mispronounce a name and spend the next week deflecting calls from a bruised billionaire's publicist. She had done this the way she did everything for him, quietly, completely, without expecting acknowledgement. By 8 o'clock, she had also laid out his cufflinks on the bathroom counter, the gold ones with the small engraved C that she had given him on their 7th anniversary. She had scheduled his car for 6:15. She had confirmed his placement at table 4 next to Senator Whitmore, because she knew Ethan had been trying to get that man's attention for 8 months, and sitting beside him at dinner would be worth more than 3 months of phone calls. She had not yet chosen her own dress, but she had 2 options pressed and waiting in the closet. The navy one, she thought. Understated. Something that would let Ethan take the room without competing. She had always thought about things that way. What would let him shine? What would make him comfortable? What would keep the peace? She told herself it was love. For a very long time she believed that was what it was. Ethan came downstairs at 8:47, already dressed from the waist up in his white shirt, looking at his phone the way he always did when he was building to something. She recognized the posture, the slight tension in his jaw, the way his eyes didn't quite meet hers when she said good morning. She handed him coffee. He took it without looking up. "I need to talk to you about tonight," he said. Charlotte set down her own mug. "Okay." He finally looked at her then, but not the way a man looks at his wife, the way a man looks at a complication he has already decided how to handle. "I'm going to bring Vanessa." The name dropped into the room like a stone into still water. Charlotte held very still. "To the gala." "It's a business decision," he said. And the ease with which he said it, the practiced, rehearsed smoothness of it, told her he had been preparing this sentence for days. Vanessa has been managing the Hartwell account. A lot of the people who will be at that event tonight are people she's already been in contact with. It makes more sense professionally for her to be there in a visible capacity. Charlotte looked at him. She had loved this man through 11 apartments, 2 cross-country moves, 3 miscarriages. He had never truly grieved with her, and more silent dinners than she could count. She had typed his vision statements at midnight and woken up at 6 to remind him which client he was flying to meet and whether he preferred window or aisle. She had been his editor, his strategist, his emotional anchor, and his memory. She had been so many things to this man that somewhere along the way she had quietly stopped being anything to herself. And now he was standing in their kitchen with her coffee in his hand, telling her she was being replaced at his most important public appearance of the year by his 28-year-old executive assistant. "Vanessa," Charlotte said again, not as a question, just repeating the word to make sure she had heard it correctly. "She's been incredible with the clients," Ethan said, already looking back at his phone. "She understands the professional landscape. These people respond to a certain kind of energy, Charlotte. It's not personal." She wanted to ask him when he had last looked at her. Not glanced, not acknowledged, truly looked. She wanted to ask him if he remembered the night they had sat on the floor of a studio apartment in Milwaukee, eating takeout noodles because they couldn't afford a table, and he had told her that she was the only reason he believed he could become something. She wanted to ask him if he remembered who had stayed up until 2 in the morning, helping him prepare for the Marchetti pitch, the one that landed him his first real investor, the one that had become the foundation of everything he was now standing on. She said none of it. What she said was, "And where does that leave me?" Ethan set down the coffee mug. "You can have the evening to yourself, go somewhere nice, order room service, relax." He straightened his collar. "You're always saying you need more rest anyway." The condescension was so casual, so completely unconscious, that Charlotte almost couldn't breathe. He wasn't even cruel about it. That was almost the worst part. He simply had no idea that what he was doing was monstrous. He had reduced her to an inconvenience so gradually over so many years that he now genuinely believed he was being reasonable. "You're taking your assistant to the Hawthorne Foundation Gala," Charlotte said slowly, "and telling me to order room service." "I knew you'd make this a thing," he said, and there was the first flash of irritation right on schedule. "This is exactly the kind of reaction that makes these events difficult, Charlotte. I need to be focused tonight. I need to be on. I can't be managing your feelings while I'm trying to build this." "Get out," she said. He blinked. "What? Get out of this kitchen," she said, her voice quiet and completely steady, "and go to your event." Something shifted in his face, surprise maybe, or the faint discomfort of a man who expected tears, and got silence instead. But Ethan Caldwell had always moved quickly past discomfort. He picked up his phone, adjusted his cufflinks, her cufflinks, the ones with the engraved C, and nodded once, as if she had simply agreed with him. "I'll be back late," he said. "Don't wait up." He was gone by 9. Charlotte stood in this kitchen for a long time after the elevator doors closed. The penthouse was enormous and absolutely silent. The coffee she had made for herself had gone cold. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, New York City moved the way it always did, indifferent, relentless, and completely unbothered by the fact that her life was crumbling in the middle of it. She picked up her mug. She poured the cold coffee down the drain. She ran the water until the drain was clear. Then she sat down at the kitchen island, opened her laptop, and tried to do what she always did. When the pain became too large, she tried to work. But the work wouldn't come today. Because today, for the first time in a very long time, Charlotte Bennett sat still long enough to hear something she had been drowning out for years. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was damning. It was the silence of a woman who had made herself so small for so long in service of someone who had stopped seeing her that she had nearly forgotten what her own voice sounded like when she wasn't performing some function on his behalf. She pulled up social media without meaning to. She wasn't sure what she was looking for. But she found it anyway, the way we always find the things we're not supposed to see. Vanessa had already posted from the car on the way to the venue, a photograph stylish and deliberately casual, the kind of photograph a young, beautiful woman takes when she wants to be noticed, but wants it to look accidental. And in the corner of the image, just barely in frame, unmistakably Ethan's hand on her knee. Charlotte closed the laptop. She did not cry. She noticed that about herself with something close to wonder. She had expected to cry. She had been on the edge of tears all morning, a slow, accumulating pressure behind her eyes that she had been careful to contain. But the photograph didn't release the tears. It dried them up entirely. Something colder moved in instead, clarity. For the first time in years, Charlotte saw her life from the outside, really saw it. And what she saw was not a marriage. It was an arrangement. A profoundly unequal arrangement in which she had provided nearly everything and been given just enough warmth and just enough acknowledgement to keep her believing it was love. She stood up. She walked to the window and looked out at the city, and then she said something out loud, alone in the penthouse, to no one at all. "I am done disappearing." She didn't know yet what that meant. She didn't have a plan. She had no idea what the next 24 hours would bring. But saying the words felt like breathing after a very long time underwater. Her phone rang at 2 in the afternoon. She didn't recognize the number. A New York area code, but not one she knew. She almost didn't answer. She was running on 4 hours of sleep and the remnants of a dignity she was trying desperately to piece back together. But something made her pick up. "Charlotte Bennett." The voice was quiet, unhurried, and unmistakably confident. the kind of voice that didn't need to announce itself because it had never needed to. "This is she," Charlotte said carefully. "This is Nathaniel Hawthorne." She sat down. She genuinely needed to. Nathaniel Hawthorne. She knew the name the way everyone in America knew it, the founder of Hawthorne Global Capital, one of the most consequential private investment firms in the country, billionaire philanthropist, and the man whose foundation was hosting the gala happening tonight. The gala her husband had just told her she was too inconvenient to attend. "Mr. Hawthorne," she said, "because what else do you say when a billionaire calls your personal cell phone in the middle of the afternoon?" "I hope I haven't caught you at a bad time," he said, and the tone was genuine rather than performative. "I'll be direct if that's all right. I'm calling because I would very much like for you to attend this evening's event." Charlotte held the phone very carefully. "I'm not sure I understand." "We met briefly," Nathaniel said several years ago, a leadership conference in Boston. "You gave a panel response that I have thought about more than once since then, about the relationship between institutional investment and community resilience. You challenged the moderator on a point that no one else in that room was willing to challenge, and you were right to do it." Charlotte remembered the conference. She had attended it at Ethan's suggestion because she was considering a pivot in her professional direction and thought it might open some doors. She had not known then that her husband would eventually use her decision to attend that conference as the moment he met the right kind of contacts and began accelerating away from the life they had built together. She had not known a lot of things then. "I remember it," she said. "I had hoped to speak with you more that afternoon," Nathaniel said. But the moment passed, and then time did what time does. A brief pause. "I understand this evening may be complicated for you. I won't pretend I don't know what complicated means in this context. What I will say is that I believe you belong in that room. Charlotte and I would consider it a personal honor if you would allow me to escort you." The penthouse was very quiet. Charlotte turned the phone over in her hand as though she could read something on the back of it that would tell her whether she was imagining this conversation. She was not the kind of woman who believed in dramatic reversals. She was not the kind of woman who held her breath waiting for rescue. She had spent the last decade trying very hard not to need anyone to save her, and the fact that she had ended up needing it anyway, needing it desperately and visibly in the dark of their beautiful apartment, was one of the things that had broken her quietest. But this was not rescue. She heard it clearly enough in his voice to know that. This was not a man who felt sorry for her. This was a man who remembered something she had forgotten about herself. And the distinction was so enormous, so achingly specific, that it cracked something open in her chest that she hadn't known was sealed. "What time should I be ready?" she asked. There was the smallest pause, and in it she thought she heard something that might have been relief. 6 o'clock, Nathaniel said. "I'll send a car." After she hung up, Charlotte sat for exactly 1 minute, doing nothing. Then she walked to the closet, moved past the navy dress she had planned to wear so Ethan could take the room, and pulled out the red one she had bought 8 months ago in a moment of uncharacteristic impulse and never worn because she had told herself it was too much. She laid it across the bed. It was not too much. She understood that now. It had never been too much. She had simply been living beside a man who wanted less of her, and she had slowly, obediently given him exactly that. By 5 o'clock, she was ready. She did not check social media again. She did not look at the photographs from the gala arrivals, which were already beginning to appear. Ethan and Vanessa on the steps, his hand on the small of her back, her smile practiced and triumphant. Other people were looking at those photographs. Charlotte could feel the silent vibration of her phone with the texts from people who felt they needed to make sure she knew what was happening. She turned the phone face down. She was not interested in knowing what everyone else already knew. She was interested in something far more difficult and far more essential. She was interested in remembering who she was before she had given so much of herself to a man who spent it carelessly. The car arrived at 5:55. Dark, understated, exactly what she would have expected from a man who had no need to prove anything. She picked up her bag, took one last look around the penthouse that had never quite felt like home, too expensive, too deliberately curated, too much a monument to the version of Ethan Caldwell that existed after she had made him possible, and walked out the door. She did not leave a note. She did not send a text. She simply left the way someone leaves when they have finally decided that staying is no longer something they are willing to do. The drive to the venue was quiet. Charlotte sat in the back seat and looked out the window and let the city move past her, the way she used to let it move past her when she was young and new to New York and full of ideas, and she had believed with the absolute sincerity of someone who has not yet been crushed by disappointment that she was going to do something that mattered. She had done something that mattered. She simply hadn't done it for herself. Tonight, that was going to change. When the car pulled up to the entrance of the Hawthorne Foundation Gala, Nathaniel was already there. Not waiting with the impatience of a man accustomed to being kept waiting, simply there precisely as he had said he would be. He was taller than she remembered from Boston. His hair had more silver in it now. He wore the kind of suit that understands it doesn't need to be noticed. When he saw her, he smiled. Not the wide, performative smile of a man trying to impress. Something quieter. Something that said, "I'm glad you came," without needing to say it at all. He offered his arm. Charlotte took it. The doors opened ahead of them, and the light of the ballroom spilled out onto the steps, and beyond those doors, she could already hear the sound of the world she had helped her husband climb into. She walked forward, not because someone was guiding her, not because she needed the night to prove anything to anyone. She walked forward because 10 years ago, a woman full of intelligence and vision and courage had started walking towards something extraordinary, and she had gotten lost somewhere along the way, and she was done being lost. The ballroom went quiet when she entered. Not all at once, in waves, the way silence moves through a crowd when something happens that no one had anticipated. Charlotte Bennett walked through the doors of the Hawthorne Foundation Gala on the arm of Nathaniel Hawthorne, and every person in that room looked up. And the woman on his arm was not who any of them had expected. She was not performing grace. She was not manufactured or strategic or braced for impact. She was simply herself in the red dress she had never worn, with the posture of a woman who had just remembered something important. And from across the ballroom, behind a table of powerful strangers who did not know they were watching a man absorb the full cost of his choices, Ethan Caldwell looked up from his phone. He saw his wife. He saw the man beside her. And for the first time in a very long time, Ethan Caldwell's face showed something that wasn't confidence. It showed fear. The car moved through Manhattan without hurrying, and Charlotte sat in the back seat with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes fixed on nothing in particular. She had stopped looking at her phone 20 minutes ago. The notifications had not stopped coming, texts from people she barely spoke to, any more women from Ethan's firm whose names she had learned at holiday parties and forgotten by February. A cousin in Ohio who had seen something on Instagram and felt the need to ask if she was okay. She was not okay. But she was something more interesting than okay, and she didn't have the language for it yet, so she turned the phone face down on the seat beside her and let the city move past the windows in long streaks of yellow and white. Nathaniel had not called again after the initial invitation. There had been no follow-up text, no assistant confirming details, no flurry of logistics designed to make her feel managed. Just the car arriving exactly when he said it would, driven by a man who introduced himself as Marcus, and then left her entirely alone with her thoughts, which was either the most considerate thing anyone had done for her in years, or a coincidence so pointed it felt intentional. She suspected it was intentional. She thought about what Ethan's face would look like when he saw her walk through those doors. She had been trying not to think about it for the past hour, the way you try not to think about a bruise pressing on it, anyway every few minutes just to confirm it still hurts. But now, 2 blocks from the venue, she let herself think about it fully. She pictured his jaw tighten the way it did when something happened outside his control. She pictured Vanessa noticing before he did, the way attentive women always notice the thing that threatens them before the man beside them does. She pictured the precise social calculation that would flicker behind Ethan's eyes in the 2 seconds between seeing her and deciding how to react. She was not going there to hurt him. She wanted to be clear with herself about that, because she had spent enough years doing things for the wrong reasons, and she didn't want to add this night to that list. She was going because a man she barely knew had remembered something about her that she had forgotten about herself, and she was no longer willing to let forgetting be the dominant condition of her life. The car stopped. Marcus opened her door without being asked. Charlotte stepped out onto the sidewalk, and the noise of the city hit her all at once, the low pulse of music from inside, the murmur of guests still arriving, the click of cameras from the small press line positioned discreetly near the entrance. She had attended enough of these events to know how they worked. She had spent enough evenings standing slightly behind Ethan, smiling at the right moments, never speaking, before he'd established the tone of the conversation. She was done with that. Nathaniel was exactly where he said he would be. He didn't make a production of seeing her. He simply turned when she approached, and the look on his face was not the look of a man executing a plan. It was the look of a man who had expected to be glad she came and discovered he was gladder than expected. "You look like yourself," he said, which was such an unusual thing to say that it took her a moment to understand it was the most precise compliment she had received in a decade. "I'm working on it," she said honestly. He smiled. "That's all any of us can do." He offered his arm. She took it. The doors opened, and the ballroom, in the way of ballrooms full of people who are paid to notice things, went quiet. Not silent, not dramatically, cinematically silent, but the particular quality of the sound in the room shifted in the way it shifts when something unexpected enters a space that thought it already knew what to expect tonight. Conversations didn't stop. They bent. People turned without turning. Eyes moved across the room the way eyes do when they are trying to assess something without appearing to assess it. Charlotte felt it all. She had spent 10 years in rooms like this one, and she had learned to read them the way a musician reads a crowd, by feel, by the change in temperature, by the specific frequencies of attention. She felt the room recalibrate around her arrival, and she kept her shoulders back and her chin level, and she did not look for Ethan. She didn't need to. She already knew where he was. She could feel it. Nathaniel guided her forward with the unhurried ease of a man who had walked into 1,000 rooms and never once needed the room to approve of him first. He introduced her as Charlotte Bennett without qualification, without the parenthetical that had followed her name for 10 years, Charlotte Caldwell, Ethan's wife. "You know Ethan." "Surely. You know Ethan." Just her name returned to her clean and complete. "Charlotte," he said to the first person who approached them, a silver-haired woman in a dark green dress who had the bearing of someone who had made several important decisions before breakfast. "This is Margaret Osei. She chairs the Foundation's education initiative." Margaret Osei extended her hand and looked at Charlotte with the direct, evaluating gaze of a woman who does not waste time. "Nathaniel mentioned you. The Boston conference, wasn't it, the panel on community investment?" Charlotte shook her hand. "That's right. He told me you were the only person in the room willing to tell Hargrove he was wrong to his face." Margaret's expression shifted into something that might have been approval. "I was at that conference. I remember thinking whoever that woman was, I hoped I'd meet her properly someday." She paused. "Here we are." Charlotte felt something loosen in her chest, something she hadn't realized was still clenched. "Here we are," she agreed. The evening moved in the way that evenings like this move, when they are going well, not in a straight line but in a spiral, each conversation pulling her deeper into a room she had always been qualified to occupy, but had been quietly, persistently, lovingly discouraged from claiming. A tech executive from Seattle who wanted her take on philanthropic infrastructure. A former senator from Georgia who had read a paper she had contributed to 3 years ago and cited it unprompted, in the middle of a conversation about educational equity. A novelist she had admired for 15 years who turned out to know her name not as Ethan Caldwell's wife, but because a mutual colleague had mentioned her work on nonprofit governance at a conference in D.C. Every conversation felt like a door opening to a room she had locked from the outside. Every handshake felt like evidence of something she had let herself forget. And through all of it, she was aware with a low, persistent, impossible-to-ignore awareness of exactly where Ethan was standing. She had not looked at him directly, not once. She didn't need to, and she wasn't ready to, and she understood that those were two different things that happened to be pointing in the same direction. But she felt the weight of his attention on her back, like a hand pressed flat between her shoulder blades. She felt it shift when she laughed at something the novelist said. She felt it intensify when Nathaniel touched her arm briefly to guide her towards someone he wanted her to meet, the casual, respectful contact of a man who is paying attention to what she needs, which was so different from the way Ethan had been touching her, or not touching her for years, that it made her throat tight. Across the room, she knew Ethan Caldwell was standing beside Vanessa Blake and experiencing something he had almost no practice with. He was feeling small. At 43 minutes into the evening, Charlotte finally looked at him. It was accidental. She turned to follow a thread of conversation toward the bar area, and he was simply there 15 feet away, standing with a drink in his hand and the careful, constructed expression of a man trying very hard to appear unbothered. Vanessa was at his elbow, her hand on his arm, her eyes moving between Charlotte and Nathaniel with the rapid calculation of a young woman suddenly understanding that she has walked into a situation whose dimensions she had not been told. Ethan met Charlotte's eyes. He looked away first. That was new. In 10 years of marriage, in 10 years of arguments and silences, and the slow, accumulated weight of being underestimated, Ethan had never been the one to look away first. He was too certain of himself, too practiced in the art of making Charlotte feel like the unreasonable party, too comfortable in the assumption that she needed his approval more than he needed hers. He looked away first, and Charlotte felt something she had not expected to feel. Not satisfaction, not triumph, something quieter and more complicated than either. Something that felt almost like grief, for the version of him she had loved before wealth taught him to stop being grateful, for the version of herself she had allowed to disappear in service of keeping him comfortable. She turned back to her conversation. She did not look at him again for a long time, but at the 90-minute mark, something happened that no one in that ballroom had anticipated. Nathaniel stepped away from the conversation they were having with a quiet, "Excuse me, it's time," and moved toward the stage with the unhurried purposefulness of a man who knows what he is about to do and has made peace with it. Charlotte watched him go with a small confusion that she didn't have time to voice before the lights in the room shifted subtly, the kind of shift that pulls attention toward the front of the space without announcing itself, and the murmur of 500 conversations began to quiet. She found herself standing beside Margaret Osei, who glanced at her sideways with an expression Charlotte could not quite read. "He didn't tell you what he's planning, did he?" Margaret said. Charlotte looked at her. "Tell me what—" Margaret pressed her lips together in a way that suggested she was choosing her words carefully. "Just listen," she said, "and stand up straight." Up. Nathaniel took the stage without fanfare. No announcement, no elaborate introduction. He simply walked up the 3 steps and stood at the podium and waited for the room to settle the rest of the way. And the room settled because 500 people who have each spent years learning to read power understood immediately that they were in the presence of someone who was about to say something true. "Every year," Nathaniel began, "I stand at this podium and I thank the people in this room for their generosity. And every year that gratitude is genuine." He paused. "Tonight, I want to do something different." The room was completely still. "I want to talk about what it costs," he said. "Not financial cost, personal cost. The cost that is paid in silence, in invisibility, in the slow erosion of a person's sense of their own value, paid most often by the people who are working the hardest, contributing the most, and receiving the least acknowledgement for it." Charlotte's hands were very still at her sides. "There is a woman in this room tonight," Nathaniel continued, and his voice was measured and clear and carried the specific weight of a man who has thought carefully about every word he is choosing, who has spent a decade making someone else's ambitions possible, who has contributed ideas, strategies, and moral clarity to work that has been publicly credited to someone else, who was told this very morning that she was too inconvenient to be seen. The room did not make a sound. "Her name is Charlotte Bennett," Nathaniel said, "and I would like her to come forward." Charlotte did not move for 3 full seconds. She was aware of this precisely because she counted them without meaning to. 1, 2, 3, the length of the silence between the moment your life changes and the moment your body catches up to the information. Margaret Osei put a hand briefly on her arm. "Go," she said quietly. Charlotte walked forward. The crowd parted in front of her, the way crowds part when they understand that something real is happening, not performed, not staged, not the ordinary choreography of a gala recognition ceremony, something with actual weight behind it. She was aware of every step. She was aware of the sound of her heels on the floor and the warmth of the lights and the 500 faces turning toward her and the one face somewhere in the middle of the crowd that she could feel without looking at. She stepped up beside Nathaniel. She did not take the microphone. She stood beside him and faced the room, and she did not flinch. 3 years ago, Nathaniel said, still speaking to the room rather than to her, I reviewed a proposal submitted by Caldwell Financial for a community reinvestment partnership. The proposal was excellent, unusually excellent, the kind of thinking that I have learned over many years to recognize as rare. He paused. I made some inquiries. What I discovered was that the foundational framework of that proposal, the intellectual core of it, the values architecture, the language that made it exceptional, had not been written by the partner whose name was on the cover. So much. The murmur that moved through the room was low and immediate, the sound of 500 people reaching the same understanding at the same moment. It had been written, Nathaniel said quietly, by the woman standing beside me. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Charlotte had ever heard. And then from somewhere in the back of the room, someone began to clap. It wasn't enthusiastic, not at first. It was a single pair of hands, slow and deliberate, and then another, and then the sound began to build in the way that genuine recognition builds, not the orchestrated applause of a planned ceremony, but the organic response of people who have just been shown something they recognized as true, and feel suddenly that they should say so. Charlotte stood on that stage and did not cry. She had promised herself she would not cry, not here, not in front of these people, not with Ethan somewhere in the crowd watching this happen. But she felt the applause move through her chest like something physical, like warmth after a very long cold, and she understood in that moment that she had been starving for something she hadn't even let herself name. She had been starving to be seen, not managed, not tolerated, not kept, seen. When the applause finally quieted, Nathaniel turned to her and said simply, "Thank you for being here tonight." Charlotte leaned toward the microphone. She had not planned to speak. She did not have prepared remarks. But something in her had come uncorked, and the words were there, the way words are sometimes there when you finally stop working so hard to hold them back. "Thank you for remembering," she said. "It's been a while since I did." The room responded to that with something softer than applause, a sound that was closer to recognition, closer to the collective exhale of people who had heard something honest and felt the relief of it. She stepped back. Nathaniel guided her down from the stage with the light, unobtrusive courtesy of a man who understood that this moment belonged to her, and his job was simply not to get in the way of it. Back in the crowd, people moved toward her, the way people move towards someone they have just been told to pay attention to, some out of genuine feeling, some out of social instinct, some out of the particular calculation of powerful people who have just been shown that they underestimated someone and want to recalibrate before it becomes a disadvantage. She received all of it with the grace of a woman who has spent a decade learning to give graciously and was only now discovering that receiving was a skill she had let atrophy. Margaret Osei found her first. "I've been waiting 15 years for Nathaniel to do something like that," she said with something that was not quite a smile, but was close to one. "He doesn't waste moments. When he uses one, it means something." "I know," Charlotte said. And she did know, though she couldn't have explained how. Across the room, she was aware of a particular quality of stillness, the kind of stillness that has a shape. She turned finally and looked at Ethan directly. He was standing alone. Vanessa was still technically nearby, 6 feet away, speaking to someone with the over-animated attention of a woman who needs to appear not to be paying attention to something. But the effect was of a man standing alone in a crowd of 500 people who had just watched his wife be publicly recognized for the work he had claimed as his own. His face was a study in controlled devastation. He was not angry. Charlotte had expected anger. It was his most reliable defense, the emotion he reached for when the world stopped confirming what he needed to believe about himself. But what she saw on his face was something she had never seen there before in 10 years of marriage. He looked lost. Not the performed vulnerability of a man trying to salvage a situation. Actually lost. The specific expression of someone who has just understood in a room full of people that the story he has been telling himself about his own life is not the story that other people see. Charlotte looked at him for a long moment. Then she turned away. Not with satisfaction, not with anger, with the specific quiet finality of a woman who has finished something she has been trying to finish for a very long time and is ready now to begin something else. Nathaniel appeared at her elbow. "You're the most interesting person at this event," he said, and it landed not as flattery, but as simple, considered fact. "I'd like to introduce you to a few more people if you have the energy for it." Charlotte looked in the room. She looked at the faces, the real ones, the ones who had turned toward her on that stage, and recognized something genuine. And she felt it again, that uncorking, that slow return of pressure that is actually the feeling of becoming yourself again after a very long time of being something smaller. "I have the energy," she said. And she meant it in ways that had nothing to do with tonight. The rest of the evening moved differently after that. Charlotte felt it in the way people approached her, not with the polite performative interest that wealthy strangers extend to someone's spouse at a formal event, but with the specific forward-leaning attention of people who have just been told they are in the presence of someone worth knowing. There is a difference, and she had learned to feel it the way you learn to feel a change in weather, not by looking at the sky, but by the change in pressure against your skin. Margaret Osei had introduced her to 3 more people before Nathaniel returned with 2 glasses of water and the quiet observation that she hadn't eaten anything since arriving. She had not. She accepted the water and the gentle redirection toward the dinner tables with something that felt surprisingly close to gratitude, not the reflexive, apologetic gratitude she had spent years performing for Ethan, but genuine gratitude, the kind that moves through you clean and leaves nothing uncomfortable behind. They sat at a table near the east side of the room, not table 4 where Ethan had been placed where she had placed him, she reminded herself, because she had been the one to call the Foundation's event coordinator 3 weeks ago and request the seating adjustment that put him next to Senator Whitmore. She had done it without being asked. She had done it because she always anticipated what he needed before he knew he needed it. And she had spent so long doing it that she had confused anticipation with love. She understood now that they were not the same thing at all. The man to her left at the table was a physician named Dr. Reginald Tate, who ran a network of community health clinics in underserved neighborhoods across the South, and who within 4 minutes of sitting down had asked Charlotte 3 questions that required her to think rather than perform. She answered them honestly, with the directness she had been suppressing for years, and watched his eyebrows rise with the specific expression of a man who was genuinely surprised to find himself in a better conversation than he expected. "Where have you been?" he said at one point, and he meant it as a compliment, but it landed in Charlotte's chest like a small blade, because the honest answer was, "I have been right here making someone else possible, and nobody thought to ask." "Around," she said, and smiled and let it go. At the other end of the table, she was aware, without looking directly, that Ethan had moved. He had left table 4. She knew this not because she was tracking him, she was actively, deliberately not tracking him, but because the particular pressure of his attention had shifted. For the past hour, it had been a fixed point at her back, a steady, uncomfortable weight. Now it was moving, circling. The way a man moves through a room when he is trying to appear purposeful while actually searching for something. He was working up to coming to her. She knew it the way she knew most things about Ethan, not because he told her, but because she had spent 10 years learning to read what he refused to say. She turned her attention back to Dr. Tate and asked him about the funding model for his clinic network, and the question opened into a 20-minute conversation that was the most intellectually alive she had felt in longer than she wanted to calculate. It was during this conversation, at almost exactly the 2-hour mark of the evening, that Ethan appeared at her shoulder. He didn't announce himself. He stood just behind her left side, which was something he did when he wanted to make a point without making a scene, and waited for her to acknowledge him. It was a power move she had seen him use in professional settings. The fact that he was using it on her here in this room told her everything she needed to know about how rattled he actually was. She finished her sentence to Dr. Tate. Then she turned. "Ethan," she said. Not coldly, not warmly, just his name returned to him at exactly the temperature he had earned. He looked worse up close than he had from across the room. The careful, constructed composure she had seen on his face earlier had developed small fractures, a tension around his eyes that he couldn't quite control, a tightness in his jaw that she recognized as the specific physical expression of Ethan Caldwell trying not to feel something he was absolutely feeling. "Can we talk?" he said. "We are talking," Charlotte said. Dr. Tate had discreetly turned to the person on his other side. She appreciated that. "Privately," Ethan said. He glanced toward a hallway near the far side of the room. 5 minutes. Charlotte looked at him steadily. "I don't think so." The flicker of surprise on his face was so fast she almost missed it. "Charlotte, I'm in the middle of a conversation, Ethan," she said, and the steadiness in her voice surprised even her. "If you have something you need to say, you can call me tomorrow." "I'm your husband. I know who you are," she said. He stood there for one more second, the second of a man recalculating, realizing that the version of Charlotte, who would have excused herself immediately, followed him to the hallway, spent 20 minutes managing his feelings in private, and then returned to the table, wearing the careful face of a woman who was fine. That version was not here tonight. She had sent herself instead. He walked away. Charlotte turned back to the table. Her hands were completely steady. She was faintly astonished by this. Dr. Tate, to his enormous credit, simply picked up the thread of conversation exactly where they had left it, and Charlotte followed him back into it with the relief of someone who has just been given permission to stay in the room they belong in. 20 minutes later, the evening shifted again. Nathaniel had rejoined the table and was in a quiet exchange with a woman named Patricia Solis, who led a national literacy foundation, when his phone vibrated and he excused himself briefly. When he came back, something in his expression had changed, not dramatically, but enough that Charlotte noticed, because she was apparently still very good at reading faces she was paying close attention to. "Is something wrong?" she asked. "No," he said. Then, after a pause, "Something has been made public that I expected to remain private for a few more days. It changes the timeline of something I had planned to address differently." Charlotte waited. Nathaniel looked at her with the direct, considered attention she was beginning to understand was simply how he operated. He looked at people the way most people look at problems they genuinely want to solve, which was to say completely without the distraction of their own reflection in the other person's eyes. "The proposal," he said, "the Caldwell financial proposal from 3 years ago. I mentioned it on stage. What I didn't mention, what I had planned to handle through the foundation's legal team next week, is that we have documentation." Charlotte was very still. "What kind of documentation?" "Emails," Nathaniel said. "Draft versions of the proposal with tracked changes attributed to your account. 2 consultants who worked on the community investment framework who have independently confirmed that the intellectual architecture of the piece came from you, and a contract signed by Ethan's firm that listed your name as a contributing author, a contract that was subsequently amended without your signature to remove it." The table was quiet. Dr. Tate had stopped pretending not to listen. Charlotte felt the information move through her slowly, the way very large things move, not fast, not sharp, but with a weight that builds as it settles. "He removed my name," she said. "Yes." "From a legal document?" "Yes." Nathaniel's voice was steady and careful. The voice of a man delivering information he knows will cause pain, and who has the decency not to rush through it. "I want you to know that I didn't mention this tonight to cause harm. I mentioned what I mentioned on that stage because I believed you deserved to be seen by the people in this room. What I'm telling you now is separate. It's information you have a right to, and what you do with it is entirely your decision." Charlotte looked at the table, then she looked up. "He removed my name from a legal document," she said again, and this time it wasn't confusion. It was the specific clarity of a woman arriving at the full understanding of something she had half known for years and refused to look at directly. "And built his reputation on the work." "The Marchetti account," Nathaniel said quietly. "The Hargrove Partnership, the community reinvestment model that was profiled in the Journal 2 years ago. Charlotte, the framework that Ethan Caldwell is known for, the thing that made him valuable in this industry, we can trace it. And it traces back to you." Across the room, Ethan was standing with a small group of men who were laughing at something. He was performing ease with the practiced fluency of someone who has been performing it for years. He had no idea that the conversation happening 40 feet away had just redrawn the map of his professional life. Charlotte watched him for a long moment. Then she said, "What does the Foundation intend to do with this?" "Nothing without your direction," Nathaniel said immediately. "This is your story. These are your contributions. How they are addressed, whether they are addressed publicly, legally, or not at all, is a decision that belongs to you. I'm not here to fight your battles, Charlotte. I'm here because you deserve to know that someone was paying attention." She nodded slowly. The words moved through her the way words move when they are true, not landing on the surface, but going deeper, finding the places that needed them. "I need to think," she said. "Take all the time you need," he said. "The documents will be there tomorrow." But tomorrow, as it turned out, could not wait for Ethan Caldwell. He came back at the 2-hour 40-minute mark, and this time he did not stand politely at her shoulder. This time he pulled a chair from a neighboring table without asking, placed it beside her, and sat down with the determined expression of a man who has spent the last hour rehearsing something and is not leaving until he delivers it. Charlotte looked at him. She was tired. Not the tired of someone defeated, the tired of someone who has been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and has just been told they are allowed to put it down. "I owe you an apology," Ethan said. The table went very quiet in the specific way that tables go quiet when everyone is listening but no one wants to appear to be listening. "For tonight," Charlotte said. He stopped, restarted. "For a lot of things." "Ethan." Her voice was not unkind. It was something more difficult. It was honest. "Don't do this here. You wouldn't talk to me privately." "Because I don't owe you a private conversation," she said. "I spent 10 years having private conversations with you. I spent 10 years managing your feelings in private so that you could present well in public. I am not doing that tonight." Something moved across his face. She had seen that expression before, the specific look of a man who has just been told something that landed because it was true, and who is deciding in real time whether to defend against it or sit with it. For most of their marriage, Ethan had chosen defense. It was faster, it was more comfortable, and Charlotte had always eventually let him. Tonight, she didn't fill the silence. She waited. And something remarkable happened. Ethan Caldwell, for possibly the first time in their marriage, sat in the silence she gave him without trying to escape it. "I knew," he said finally, quietly. So quietly that she wasn't certain she'd heard correctly. "About the proposal, about the framework. I told myself it was a collaboration. I told myself we were a team and that credit was a formality." He looked at his hands. "I knew." Charlotte felt the words arrive somewhere very deep. "I know you knew," she said. He looked up at her. The composed, polished face of Ethan Caldwell, Wall Street executive and professional self-made man, had come almost entirely apart. What was underneath was something she hadn't seen in years. The man who had sat on the floor of a Milwaukee apartment eating noodles and told her she was the only reason he believed he could become something. She had loved that man. She had given that man everything she had. "I don't know how to fix it," he said. "I know that too," Charlotte said gently. "Tell me what to do." His voice cracked on the last word just barely, just enough to hear it. "Charlotte, tell me what to do and I'll do it." She looked at him for a long moment. Long enough to feel everything she had ever felt for him pass through her in a kind of final review, the love and the grief and the years of slow erosion, and the 1,000 small moments of choosing him over herself until choosing him over herself had simply become the shape of her life. "Go home," she said. "Not to our apartment. Go to wherever it is that the version of you who is honest lives and stay there for a while. And stop performing." She paused. "That's the only thing I have left to tell you, Ethan. I've spent 10 years telling you things. I'm done." He opened his mouth, closed it again. He stood up slowly, the way a man stands when the weight of something has become physical. He looked at her one more time, and she let him look because she understood that this was the last time he would look at her this way, as his wife, as the woman he had slowly, carelessly, catastrophically let go of. And then he nodded once, put his chair back, and walked away. Vanessa was gone when Charlotte looked up. She didn't know when that had happened. She found she didn't particularly care. Nathaniel, who had been quietly giving the last several minutes the extraordinary gift of his silence, leaned slightly toward her. "Are you all right?" he asked. Charlotte took a slow breath. She checked. The way you check when someone asks you that question, and you actually want to answer it honestly rather than reflexively. "I think I'm better than all right," she said. "I think I'm the closest to all right I've been in years." He nodded, accepting this. "Good." Dr. Tate, on her other side, refilled her water glass without a word. It was such a small, considerate gesture that Charlotte almost laughed. She contained it, but barely. The evening was winding down now. The formal program had concluded. Guests were moving toward the exits in the slow, reluctant way that guests move at the end of an event that went better than expected. People kept stopping to speak to her on their way out, a business card pressed into her hand by a woman who ran a leadership development program, an invitation from Patricia Solis to join the Literacy Foundation's advisory board as a guest speaker, a quietly sincere compliment from Senator Whitmore, who, had she now understood, spent the entire evening at table 4 being charmed by Ethan, and was now standing in front of Charlotte, visibly recalibrating which Caldwell he should have been paying attention to. She accepted everything. She wrote nothing down and forgot nothing. And at some point near the end of the evening, when most of the guests had gone and the room had taken on the particular quality of a space returning to itself after having been borrowed, Charlotte found herself standing near the tall windows with Nathaniel. The city spread out below them in its usual indifferent brilliance, and she realized something that surprised her with its simplicity. She was not thinking about Ethan. She was not running a mental inventory of what she had lost, or what she might recover, or what the next conversation would cost her. She was not managing anyone's feelings, not anticipating anyone's needs, not making herself smaller so that someone else could feel larger. She was just standing there, present in her own life for the first time in a very long time. "What are you thinking about?" Nathaniel asked. Charlotte considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I'm thinking," she said slowly, "that I used to be someone who had opinions about things, real opinions, not the kind you sand down at the edges so nobody feels challenged, the actual kind." She paused. "I'd like to be that person again." Nathaniel looked at her in that direct, unhurried way of his. "You were that person tonight," he said, "from the moment you walked in." She turned to look at him. "How did you know? When you called this afternoon, you hadn't seen me in years. How did you know I'd be worth calling?" He was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that isn't avoiding a question, but is genuinely considering how to answer it honestly. "Because the woman I met in Boston," he said finally, "was someone who said true things in rooms that rewarded comfortable things. That's not a skill that goes away, Charlotte. It gets suppressed. It gets discouraged. It gets trained out of people by the people around them who feel threatened by it." He paused. "But it doesn't go away." Charlotte felt something move through her chest, warm and enormous, and very close to grief, and very close to joy, the specific emotional key that is struck when someone sees you so accurately that it hurts in the best possible way. "Thank you," she said. And she meant it in all the ways that a woman means thank you when she is standing at the edge of the rest of her life and someone has just handed her back herself. The city below them went on doing what cities do. Somewhere in it, Ethan Caldwell was being driven home by a car she had scheduled to an apartment she had decorated, carrying a reputation she had helped him build, sitting with the full weight of what that meant. And Charlotte Bennett stood at the window and felt for the first time in 10 years like she had enough room to breathe. She did not go back to the penthouse that night. It was a decision she made somewhere between the elevator and the lobby of the gala venue, in the 7 seconds it took for the doors to close and open again on the ground floor. She stood in the lobby with her bag on her shoulder and her phone in her hand, and she thought about walking into that apartment, the one she had furnished and organized and made livable, the one that had never quite felt like home, because a home requires 2 people who are both actually present in it, and she could not make herself do it. She called a car. Not Marcus this time, just a regular car, anonymous and unremarkable, because she was not a woman being escorted anywhere tonight. She was a woman going somewhere on her own. She checked into a hotel 6 blocks from the penthouse. She had never done this before, checked into a hotel in her own city to avoid her own apartment. It felt dramatic and also completely sane, which she understood was the specific feeling of doing something healthy for the first time after years of prioritizing someone else's comfort over your own. The room was clean and quiet, and entirely hers. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at her phone. 11 missed calls from Ethan, 4 texts. She read the texts because she had spent 10 years being the kind of woman who read his texts, and old habits are not undone in a single evening, no matter how consequential that evening has been. The first text said, "Charlotte, we need to talk." The second said, "I didn't handle tonight well." The third said, "Please come home." The fourth, sent at 12:47 in the morning, said simply, "I'm sorry." She put the phone face down on the nightstand. She was not ready to respond to, "I'm sorry." Not because she didn't believe he meant it. She thought he probably did in the limited self-protective way that people mean things when the consequences of their actions have finally become unavoidable. But sorry was not a plan. Sorry was not accountability. Sorry was the first word of a very long conversation that she was not prepared to have at 12:47 in the morning in a hotel room 6 blocks from a life she was no longer certain she wanted to return to. She slept better than she had in months. She woke at 6:15 to 3 more texts from Ethan and a voicemail from a number she didn't recognize. She listened to the voicemail first. It was from a woman named Diana Cho, who identified herself as a producer at a national morning news program. She had attended the gala the previous evening. She was interested in speaking with Charlotte about the possibility of an interview. Charlotte listened to the message twice. Then she set the phone down and went to shower because the world moving faster than she was ready for it to move was not a new experience, and she had learned a long time ago that the best response to acceleration was to slow herself down deliberately and think. By 8 o'clock, she was dressed, drinking coffee in the hotel restaurant, and had spoken by phone to Margaret Osei, who had apparently been expecting her call. "I knew you wouldn't go back last night," Margaret said with the satisfaction of someone who had been right about something important. "Good. Don't go back yet." "I need to think," Charlotte said. "I know. That's why I'm telling you not to go back yet. The apartment is his environment. You've spent 10 years operating on his terrain. Think on your own terrain first." A pause. "Do you have somewhere to go?" Charlotte thought about this. She had a sister in Philadelphia. She had a college friend in D.C. who had texted her at 11 the previous night, 3 words, "I saw the video," which told Charlotte that whatever had happened on that stage had already moved beyond the walls of the ballroom, which was information she needed to process carefully, and had not yet had time to process at all. "I'll figure something out," Charlotte said. "You will," Margaret said with a certainty that was not performative. "Call me if you need anything. I mean that practically, not politely." Charlotte believed her. She was on her second cup of coffee when her phone rang again. Not Ethan this time, Nathaniel. She answered on the second ring. "Good morning," he said. "I hope I'm not calling too early." "You're not." "I wanted to check in. Last night was a great deal to absorb in a few hours." "It was?" she agreed. "I'm absorbing. How are you doing with it?" She considered the question honestly. "I feel like someone handed me a box that's been sitting in a room I wasn't allowed to enter for 10 years, and I'm only just beginning to understand what's inside it." A brief silence. "That's an accurate description," he said. "Charlotte, I want to be straightforward with you about something. The documentation I mentioned last night, the emails, the contract amendment, the Foundation's legal team will be proceeding with a review regardless of what you decide to do personally. The removal of your name from that document is a matter of record, and it has implications for the partnership the Foundation entered into with Caldwell Financial. That review is going to happen." Charlotte set down her coffee cup. "What does that mean for Ethan?" "At minimum, it means the partnership will be suspended pending the review. Depending on what the review establishes, it could mean dissolution of the contract. It could mean the Foundation pursuing recovery of fees paid under terms that were misrepresented." He paused. "I want to be clear. This is not something I'm doing to punish him. This is the Foundation responding to a legal irregularity that we have an obligation to address." Charlotte was quiet for a moment. She was thinking about Ethan's face when he sat down beside her at the table. "I knew." That was what he had said. "I knew about the proposal. I told myself it was a collaboration." He had known. He had removed her name from a legal document and built his career on the framework she had created, and told himself it was a collaboration, which was the specific self-deception of a man who needed to believe his success was his own, more than he needed to be honest about how it had been built. "He's going to need a lawyer," Charlotte said. "Yes," Nathaniel said. "He is." Another silence. Charlotte looked at her coffee cup. She felt the weight of it, not vindication, nothing as simple as that. The specific grief of watching the consequences of someone's choices arrive at their door and understanding that you loved them once, and that love did not protect either of you from this. "I'm not going to interfere with the Foundation's process," she said finally. "Whatever the legal review establishes that belongs to you and your team. I have my own decisions to make, and they're separate." "I understand," Nathaniel said, "and I respect that." Another brief pause. "I would like to ask you one thing, if I may." "Go ahead." "The woman who challenged Hargrove on that panel in Boston," he said, "had a framework of her own, not just the investment model, a genuine intellectual framework for how communities and institutions create sustainable value together. It was evident in everything she said that afternoon. I've thought about it many times since." He paused. "Has that framework gone anywhere? Has it become anything?" Charlotte was very still. The honest answer was no. The honest answer was that she had developed it further over the years privately in notebooks and late-night documents, that she had returned to the way you return to a garden you're not sure you're allowed to tend carefully in stolen moments, half convinced that the work wasn't serious because no one had told her it was. She had never submitted it anywhere. She had never presented it formally. She had occasionally used pieces of it to help Ethan refine his thinking, which was how pieces of it had ended up in the Caldwell financial proposal attributed to him. "It exists," she said carefully. "I'd like to read it," Nathaniel said. "If you're willing. Not for any purpose other than the one I'm describing. I think it's important work, and I'd like to see where it is." Charlotte pressed her lips together. She was fighting something, not reluctance exactly, but the deeply ingrained reflex of a woman who has been told in 1,000 indirect ways that her independent thinking is less valuable than her supportive thinking. The reflex that says, your ideas are better as background material for someone else's presentation than as something standing on their own. She fought it. She beat it. "I'll send it to you," she said. At 10:30 that morning, she called her sister in Philadelphia. Her sister's name was Rose, and Rose was 3 years younger and significantly more direct, which had been a source of friction between them for decades, and was this morning exactly what Charlotte needed. "I saw the video," Rose said, before Charlotte could say anything beyond hello. "It's been shared 40,000 times. There's a clip of you on stage, and people are writing paragraphs about it in the comments." Charlotte absorbed this. "What kind of paragraphs?" "The kind that women write when they recognize something," Rose said. "Charlotte people are, look, I'm just going to say it. You went viral, in the best possible way. Women who have been in your situation are describing your face on that stage like they saw themselves in it." Charlotte put a hand over her eyes. She had not anticipated this. She had not thought beyond the room. She had not considered that the room had a door, and the door led to the internet, and the internet was very, very large. "I need to come to Philadelphia," she said. "I have your room ready," Rose said without a moment's hesitation. "Come today." She checked out of the hotel at 11. She left a brief text for Ethan. "I need space to think. I'll be in touch when I'm ready. Please don't call." She was not cruel, and she was not cold because she did not need to be either of those things. She was simply honest, which was something she was relearning how to be. The train to Philadelphia took an hour and 40 minutes. She spent the first 30 minutes looking at her phone at the clip Rose had mentioned, which was not 40,000 shares anymore, but closer to 90, at the comments that her sister had described, which were exactly what Rose had said. They were at the direct messages from women she had never met who had written to her with the urgency of people who needed to say something to someone who would understand. She read as many of them as she could before the weight of them became something she needed to set down for a while. Then she put the phone in her bag and looked out the window for the remaining 70 minutes and let herself be in motion without managing anything or anyone, which was she was discovering one of the most radical things she had done in years. Rose was waiting at the station. She was shorter than Charlotte by 4 inches and louder by about 40%. and she pulled her sister into a hug that lasted long enough to mean something. "You look different," Rose said when she let go. "I feel different," Charlotte said. "Good different or scary different?" Charlotte thought about it. "Both," she said, at the same time. Rose nodded as if this was the correct answer. "Come on, I made food." The next 48 hours were the quietest Charlotte had experienced in a decade. Not empty, Rose's house was full of noise and children and the specific productive chaos of a woman who had built a life on her own terms, but quiet in the sense that mattered, which was that nobody in that house needed anything from Charlotte except her company. She slept. She ate real meals at a table with other people. She played board games with her niece and nephew and lost spectacularly and didn't mind at all. She sat on Rose's back porch in the evenings and talked to her sister the way they had talked when they were young, before adult life and distance, and the slow drift of separate priorities had made their relationship something that existed mainly in holiday phone calls and obligatory texts. On the second morning, she received an email from the Foundation's legal team. Formal, precise, and informative. The review had begun. Ethan had been notified. The Caldwell Financial Partnership was suspended pending findings. The email did not ask her to do anything. It was informational only, as Nathaniel had promised. She forwarded it to the lawyer she had called the previous afternoon, a woman named Sandra Kress, who specialized in intellectual property and contract law, and who had, upon hearing the basic outline of the situation, said, "This is not unusual, and you have more options than you think," with the calm certainty of someone who had navigated this territory before. At 2 p.m. on the second day, Ethan called from a number she didn't recognize his office line, which told her his personal calls were going unanswered, and he had resorted to trying something she might not screen. She almost didn't pick up. She picked up because she was at her core, someone who believed in finishing conversations rather than leaving them open, and this conversation had been open for 10 years. "Charlotte?" His voice was raw in a way she hadn't heard since the early years before success had given him a layer of polish over everything. "Ethan, I need to tell you something," he said, "and I need you to hear it before the lawyers make it into something else." She waited. "I have been talking to someone," he said, "a therapist. I started 3 weeks ago." A pause. "I didn't tell you because I didn't know how to tell you without it becoming something you managed for me, which is—" He stopped. "Which is what I always did. Made you manage things for me." Charlotte sat with this. 3 weeks ago meant before the gala, before last night, before any of this had erupted into visibility. "Why 3 weeks ago?" she asked. A long silence. "Because Vanessa told me something," he said, and the way he said it was not the way a man says the name of a woman he is involved with. It was the way a man says the name of a person who told him an uncomfortable truth. "She told me that the way I talked about you made her uncomfortable, that I spoke about you like you were furniture. Her word." His voice was unsteady. "She told me she didn't want to be the kind of person who was complicit in that." Charlotte felt something she had not expected to feel about Vanessa Blake, which was a reluctant, complicated respect. "She was right," Charlotte said. "I know," Ethan said. "I've known a lot of things for a long time that I refuse to look at." His voice dropped. "The proposal. Charlotte, I need you to know what I did with the contract removing your name. I have told my lawyer to cooperate fully with the Foundation's review. Whatever they find, whatever they determine, I'm not going to fight it." She was quiet. "I'm not saying this to get something from you," he said, as if he had heard the question forming in her silence. "I'm saying it because it's the right thing to do, and I have spent too many years doing the wrong thing while telling myself it was complicated." Charlotte stood up from Rose's kitchen chair and walked to the window. Outside, Rose's children were running through the yard, loud and careless, and completely unburdened by history, and she watched them for a moment before she spoke. "Ethan," she said, "I believe you mean what you're saying right now. I genuinely do." She paused. "And I need you to understand that meaning it doesn't change what I'm going to do." "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to take my framework," she said, "the one you used without crediting me, the one I've been developing for 15 years, in the margins of a life I kept putting on hold, and I'm going to do something with it. My own thing, on my own terms." She paused. "And I'm going to get a divorce, Ethan. Not because I hate you, Not because of last night, because I have spent 10 years becoming invisible and I cannot do that in the same space where it happened. I need to start somewhere new." The silence on his end was long. "Okay," he said finally. "Just that. Okay, not a fight, not a negotiation, not the practiced deflection of a man protecting his position. Just okay said by a man who had finally run out of arguments against his own behavior. "Take care of yourself," Charlotte said, and she meant it. She was surprised by how much she meant it. "Go to therapy. Do the work. Not for me, for yourself." She hung up. Rose was in the doorway. She had not been eavesdropping, she had simply run out of reasons to be in a different room. She looked at her sister with the expression of a woman who has been worrying about the same person for a very long time and has just watched the thing she was worried about begin to resolve itself. "You okay?" Rose asked. Charlotte turned away from the window. She checked the way she was learning to check honestly, carefully, without the reflex of performing fine when she wasn't. "I think," she said slowly, "that I am more okay than I have been in a very long time, and it doesn't feel the way I thought it would." "How does it feel?" Charlotte considered this for a moment. Outside, her niece shrieked with laughter at something her brother had done, and the sound came through the window bright and unguarded and completely itself. "It feels like room," Charlotte said. "Like I suddenly have room for something. I don't know what yet, but it's there. I can feel it." Rose crossed the kitchen and put her arms around her sister again. Charlotte let herself be held. She was learning to let herself be held. It was harder than she expected, and more necessary than she had known. Her phone buzzed on the table. She didn't look at it. She already knew what was coming next. Not the specific details, those would arrive one at a time in their own order, the way things always arrive when a life is reorganizing itself. But the shape of it, the direction, the specific feeling of moving towards something rather than away from it. She had been moving away from herself for 10 years. She was done. The divorce papers arrived on a Tuesday morning in November, 3 months after the gala. Charlotte was sitting at the desk in her new apartment. Her apartment, not a penthouse chosen for its address, not a space curated to reflect someone else's ambition, but a 2-bedroom on the 4th floor of a building in Brooklyn that got good light in the mornings and had a neighbor who played piano badly and enthusiastically every evening around 7, which she had decided to find charming rather than annoying because she was practicing the radical act of choosing how she related to the things around her. She was drinking coffee. She was reading through the final edits on the first 3 chapters of a book she had not told anyone she was writing until 6 weeks ago, when she had told Nathaniel and Rose on the same afternoon back-to-back because they were the 2 people whose reactions she trusted to be honest rather than managed. Rose had said, "Finally, I've been waiting for you to do this for 15 years. Nathaniel had said, "Send me the outline when you're ready. I know 3 people who need to read it." She had sent him the outline the following week. He had responded within 24 hours with 4 pages of notes, not corrective, not directive, but the kind of notes that a brilliant reader leaves when they have been genuinely engaged by something and want the writer to know exactly where and why. She had read his notes 3 times. She had disagreed with 2 of his suggestions and told him so directly, and he had responded, "You're right, keep it your way." Which was such a specific and unfamiliar experience, being told she was right by a man who was not threatened by it, that she had sat with her phone in her hand for a full minute before she could move on. The divorce papers were in a large envelope that her lawyer, Sandra Kress, had messengered over that morning, with a handwritten note attached. "Read carefully. Call me with questions. Take your time. There is no rush on your end." Charlotte made herself finish her coffee before she opened the envelope. She was learning to do things like this, to not let urgency dictate her pace when the urgency belonged to someone else's timeline. She drank her coffee. She read 2 more pages of her edited chapters. She acknowledged to herself that the chapters were good. She was learning to do that too, to assess her own work with something approaching fairness, rather than the reflexive self-deprecation that had been her default for so long she had mistaken it for humility. Then she opened the envelope. The papers were thorough and precise, which was what she was paying Sandra Kress to ensure. The settlement was not vindictive. Charlotte had been clear about that from the beginning, not because she didn't have grounds for anger, and not because she had been advised to be generous, but because she had made a decision in Rose's kitchen in Philadelphia that vindication was not the point. The point was a clean break. The point was walking forward without dragging the weight of a protracted legal war behind her. Sandra had respected this while ensuring that Charlotte's actual interests, financial, intellectual, professional, were fully protected. The framework attribution was addressed. The contract amendment had been corrected through the Foundation's review process, and a formal acknowledgement of Charlotte's intellectual contribution to the community investment model that had defined the early years of Caldwell Financial's reputation had been entered into the legal record. Ethan had not fought it. This was the thing she returned to sometimes alone in the mornings before the day got going, when she allowed herself to process the parts of this she hadn't fully processed yet. He had not fought any of it. His lawyer had negotiated the financial terms with Sandra in 3 sessions that Charlotte's lawyer described as unusually cooperative. He had signed the intellectual property acknowledgement without a counterproposal. He had done what he told her he would do, which was cooperate fully and stop fighting things he no longer had the moral standing to fight. She didn't know how to feel about this exactly. She was working on that. She signed the divorce papers at 9:17 in the morning at her own desk in her own apartment with her own pen. Then she took a photograph of the signed pages, not for social media, not for anyone else, just for herself, and texted it to Sandra with the message, "Done." Sandra replied within 3 minutes, "I'll file today. Congratulations on your next chapter." That last word was an accident, I think, but it feels right. Charlotte looked in the word chapter for a moment. Then she set the phone down, picked up her coffee cup, and went to refill it, because she had work to do and a life to build, and she was not the kind of woman who marked endings by falling apart. She was learning, in fact, that she had never been that kind of woman. She had simply been surrounded for too long by someone who benefited from her believing she was fragile. She wasn't fragile. She was tired. Those were different things, and knowing the difference had changed her life. At 11 o'clock, her phone rang. Diana Cho, the morning news producer, who had left a voicemail the morning after the gala. Charlotte had spoken with her twice in the intervening months, the first time to say she wasn't ready, and the second time to say she was thinking about it. Diana had been patient in the specific professional way of someone who understands that the story is better if the subject comes to it on her own terms. "I heard from your lawyer's office this morning," Diana said. "I wanted to call." "News travels fast," Charlotte said. "In my line of work, it does." A brief pause. "How are you?" "I signed the papers this morning," Charlotte said. "I feel clear. That's the best word I have for it." "Clear is a good word," Diana said. "Charlotte, I don't want to push, but I want to say something I've been sitting on for a few months." She paused. "The clip from the gala has been viewed 11 million times. 11 million. And the comments are they're not what you usually see on the internet. They're women writing about their own marriages, their own careers, their own 10 years of disappearing inside someone else's life. You touched something real. And I think there are a lot of people who would benefit from hearing you talk about it in your own words." Charlotte walked to her window. Outside, Brooklyn went about its business in the loud, unbothered way that Brooklyn always did. She had lived in this apartment for 8 weeks, and she already felt more at home in it than she had felt in the penthouse in 3 years. "I'll do the interview," she said, "on one condition. Name it." "I talk about the work," Charlotte said. "Not the marriage, not Ethan, the work, the framework, what I've been building for 15 years and what I'm building now. The marriage is context. The work is the story." A silence on Diana's end. Then, "That's actually a better interview." "I know," Charlotte said. She hung up and stood at the window for another minute. Then she went back to her desk, opened her manuscript, and kept writing. The interview aired 6 weeks later on a Thursday morning in December, and Charlotte watched it from Rose's couch in Philadelphia because she had driven down the night before, and she did not want to be alone when it aired, which was an act of self-knowledge that would have been unthinkable to the version of her who had spent 10 years managing everyone else's emotional needs while quietly starving her own. Rose made coffee and sat beside her and did not say anything unnecessary, which was one of the most loving things another person had ever done for her. On screen, Charlotte was composed and direct and spoke without apology about the 15 years of intellectual work she had done in the margins of her own life. She talked about the community investment framework in specific terms, what it was, where it had come from, what she believed it could do in the hands of institutions willing to use it seriously. She talked about what it had cost her to realize that her ideas had value independent of the man she had attached them to. She talked about what she was building now. She did not mention Ethan by name, not once. The interviewer had tried twice to redirect her toward the personal narrative, the GALA, the humiliation, the billionaire who had intervened. Charlotte had redirected back both times with the calm, pleasant firmness of a woman who had decided what the story was and was not going to be talked out of it. By noon on the day the interview aired, her publisher, she had a publisher now, a real one, who had come to her through Nathaniel's introduction and offered her a contract she had not accepted until Sandra had reviewed every line of it. Her publisher called to say that pre-orders for the book had jumped significantly. By 3 o'clock, Patricia Solis from the Literacy Foundation called to formally confirm Charlotte's place on the advisory board, which had been tentatively discussed and never quite finalized, and to mention that 3 other foundations had inquired about her availability for similar roles. By 5 o'clock, she had 17 new emails in the professional inbox she had set up 3 months ago from universities, nonprofits, consulting firms, and one very large hospital network that had read about her community investment framework and wanted to discuss its application to healthcare infrastructure. She read each email carefully. She responded to none of them that day. She was learning the difference between urgency and importance, and she was practicing the discipline of letting important things wait for the time they deserved, rather than responding to everything immediately out of the reflexive people-pleasing that had governed her professional behavior for a decade. Rose made dinner. Charlotte helped. They talked about things that had nothing to do with any of it. Rose's children, a home renovation that was 3 months behind schedule, a book they had both read and disagreed about, and it was ordinary and warm and entirely real, and Charlotte felt the ordinariness of it like something precious, because she understood now what she had not understood for most of her adult life, which was that the ordinary moments of genuine connection are not the gaps between the important things. They are the important things. She drove back to Brooklyn the next morning. 2 weeks before Christmas, Nathaniel called. Not about the book, not about the foundation, not about any of the professional threads that had begun to weave themselves into something that looked unmistakably like a career she had built for herself, rather than in service of someone else's. He called at 7 in the evening, which was outside his usual hours, and he said, "I'd like to take you to dinner. Not a foundation event, not a professional occasion. Dinner, if you're willing." Charlotte was quiet for a moment. She had thought about this. She would have been dishonest if she said she hadn't thought about it. She had felt from the evening of the gala a quality of attention in Nathaniel that she had not allowed herself to examine too closely, partly because she was in the middle of dismantling a marriage and it felt premature, and partly because she had learned to be suspicious of her own impulses toward men who made her feel seen, given what the last one had cost her. But Nathaniel was not Ethan. She knew this in the clear, uncomplicated way that you know true things when you are no longer working very hard to pretend they are complicated. He was not a man who needed her to make him possible. He did not need managing or editing or the quiet labor of someone who stayed up late making sure his presentations were brilliant. He was already brilliant in the self-possessed way of people who built something real and didn't need constant confirmation of it. What he had offered her from the first phone call to the present moment was not rescue, it was regard. And she was beginning to understand that regard, genuine, unhurried, honest regard, was not something she had experienced enough of in her adult life, and that she was not required to be suspicious of it simply because she had once confused something lesser for it. "Yes," she said, "I'd like that." The restaurant he chose was quiet and unhurried and had nothing to prove, which seemed right. They talked for 3 hours. Not about the foundation, not about the book, not about Ethan or the gala or any of the events that had brought her to this point. They talked the way two people talk when they are genuinely curious about each other and have the confidence to show it about ideas about the things that had shaped them, about what they had gotten wrong and what they were still trying to understand. At one point he asked her, "What do you want? Not professionally, not from this dinner. In general, what do you actually want from your life?" And Charlotte, who had not been asked this question, not seriously, not by anyone who intended to hear the answer in longer than she could calculate, sat with it for a moment and then answered it. "I want to be useful in ways that are mine," she said. "I want to do work that has my name on it. I want to be in rooms where I'm there because of what I think, not because of who I'm attached to." She paused. "And I want to be with people who don't need me to be smaller than I am. That's it. That's all of it." Nathaniel looked at her steadily. "That's not a small list." "No," she agreed. "It isn't. It's also entirely reasonable." "I know," she said. "I'm just now getting comfortable with the fact that I'm allowed to want reasonable things." He smiled. It was the same smile from the steps of the gala, not wide, not performed, just present. "You're allowed," he said simply. She believed him. The book came out the following spring on a Tuesday in March, with Charlotte Bennett's name on the cover, in letters she had stared at for a full minute when she first saw the final proof, not because she couldn't believe it, but because she wanted to give the moment the attention it deserved. The cover was clean. The subtitle was long and precise and described exactly what was inside. There were no photographs of her marriage, no references to the gala, no narrative of a woman reborn through humiliation. It was a book about ideas, her ideas, 15 years of thinking about how communities and institutions create sustainable value together, refined and completed, and offered to the world on its own terms. It was reviewed seriously in serious places by serious people. It was not a sensation. It was better than a sensation. It was the beginning of a body of work that people would return to and argue about and build on, which was the only kind of legacy that Charlotte had ever actually wanted and had spent too many years building for someone else. She attended the book launch alone. Then Nathaniel arrived because she had told him the time, and he had shown up not to be seen with her, but because he wanted to be there. And there was a difference that she felt clearly. Rose was there. Margaret Osey was there. Dr. Reginald Tate was there. Sandra Kress was there. Patricia Solis was there. Diana Cho was there with a camera crew she had negotiated permission to bring discreetly. And somewhere across the city, she knew without knowing how she knew, Ethan Caldwell was doing the work his therapist had assigned him, or not doing it, building something new, or not building it. His choices belonged to him now. She had her own to make. She stepped up to the podium at her own book launch and looked out at the room, not a ballroom full of 500 powerful strangers this time, but a bookstore full of 50 people who had come because they were interested in the ideas, which was exactly the kind of room she had always wanted to speak in. She opened her mouth and said true things, not the things that would be repeated for applause, not the things calibrated to land with the right people in the right order, just the things that were true offered directly without apology and without performance. Afterward, a woman came up to her. She was in her 60s, gray-haired and direct-eyed, and she held the book in both hands the way people hold things they intend to keep. "I read the excerpt online," the woman said. "I've been waiting 40 years for someone to say this in print." Charlotte took her hand. "I'm glad it got here eventually," she said. "Better late than never," the woman said firmly. Charlotte laughed, and the laugh was genuine and unguarded, the laugh of a woman who has come back to herself after a long absence and discovered that herself is someone worth coming back to. Later that night in her apartment, she sat at her desk in the quiet and looked at the copy of her own book that her publisher had given her at the launch. She opened it to the dedication page. She had written it 3 months ago and revised it once and then left it alone because it was right, and she had learned to leave things alone when they were right. The dedication read, "For the woman I almost let disappear." She found her way back. This is what she brought with her. Charlotte closed the book. She set it on her desk beside her coffee cup and her manuscript pages and the framed photograph of Rose's children that she had placed there on her first day in this apartment because she wanted to see something real every time she looked up from the work. She had signed the divorce papers in this room. She had written a book in this room. She had slept 8 hours a night in this room and eaten breakfast without checking her phone first and cried twice and laughed more than she had in years and learned slowly the revolutionary practice of taking up the space she was actually entitled to. She was not finished. She was nowhere near finished. She had a second book taking shape in a notebook in her desk drawer and 3 speaking invitations she hadn't responded to yet, and a conversation with Nathaniel scheduled for Saturday evening that she was looking forward to with the uncomplicated, undefended anticipation of a woman who has stopped bracing for disappointment. She was not waiting to be saved. She was not performing recovery for an audience. She was not defined by the night she was publicly humiliated, or by the man who had spent a decade making her invisible, or by the billionaire who had remembered her when she had forgotten herself. She was defined by what she did next. And Charlotte Bennett, author, board member, thinker, woman, had a great deal left to do. She turned off the light on her desk, got up, and walked toward the rest of her life. Not because someone had finally chosen her, but because she had finally, completely, and without apology, chosen herself. That was the only choice that had ever mattered, and she would never forget it again.